So where we left off yesterday, and the main thrust of yesterday, was we were trying to get to a point where we could kind of use fragments to start to change how the kind of the flows of our app work differently based on the size of the device, right? So maybe we want to combine some screens on larger devices or split them on smaller devices, right? So the main thing we did was we went ahead and kind of did some prep work. We took our movie details activity and we extracted a lot of the code, put it into a fragment, and the benefit of doing that now is the fragment, that movie details fragment really doesn't have to be its own screen. It can be part of another screen, or it can be its independent self. So that enables us now to use it in both, reuse that code in both contexts. We can use it on a phone where it's going to be still its own separate screen. We can have it if we need to have direct links into our apps, such as the share. We can still have those shares work directly into the detail screen, even on larger devices if we need it to happen. And when we're talking about as far as on the tablet, we can now start putting those two things side by side, the list and the details, instead of having them be two separate screens. Make sense? So what I want to do today is work us through this, right? Is work us to the view on tablets where they're both on the same screen, okay? Along the way, obviously, we don't want to break the flow on the layout. So we have to be a little bit careful about how we go about that. Okay. It also means that we're going to have to figure a few problems out because remember that we were able to move most of it into the fragment, but not all of it, right? There were some things that we had to keep in the activity, remember? So those are things we still have to figure out. How are we going to make that work with the home activity, especially when the home activity might just be the movie list, or it might be movie list plus movie details, right? And you also actually have two lists there, right? Because we have both the user list and the user, both the movie list and the user list there, right? So both of those have to kind of work together and use the same details pane. Okay? So that's what we're working towards today. So I'm going to start by just opening the project. And we'll start from there. So I'm going to pop up the movie details project and take a look at it. Now, if you've got your physical tablet, I would really recommend pulling that out and having that to test with today. Otherwise, I'll be testing this on the one of the tablet emulators primarily with an anonymous login.
What do you mean by, anonymous login? You're just talking about...
The guest login that I added at the beginning.
Do you have to do that in order to do what we're about to do?
Because the regular login doesn't work on the tablet emulators. They don't have the Play Store. There's no tablet emulators with the Play Store on them. So unfortunately I can't test login and tablet at the same time. And I can't really stream the tablet screen, unfortunately. Because Samsung's also not enabled that feature. So some issues there too. All right, so I'm going to go into 7-inch tablet, and I'm going to run on that device. So continue as guest. And so right now, this is what I have. You know, on the portrait version of this layout, it looks like so. If I turn it sideways, it's going to look like this. So things I've already done, I already went and kind of modified the tablet layout to make those two spinners horizontal, both at 600 and 900. And I've also changed the number of columns that are appearing there, right? So I've already tried to do a little bit of work here and try to make it fit the tablet a little bit better, okay? Those might potentially cause some issues, so those are things we may have to backtrack as we're doing this process. But notice here, you know, this is actually interesting in that this is, you know, in landscape, I'm getting the 900 dp version, versus in portrait, I'm getting the 600 dp version. Okay. So the place I'm going to put the breakpoint for what I'm going to do is going to be at the 600 dp point, but there's also reasons why you might want to put it at 900 instead of 600. You know, because if we put it at 900, that would be tablet landscape, but not tablet portrait. Does that make sense? So depending on where we put that breakpoint, we're going to have a different outcome. But I'm going to put that breakpoint at 600 dp, and we can look at it. We might decide at the end, maybe we like it better at 900, but I'm going to start it at that 600 breakpoint. Okay? So number one to pay attention to is also that we have that. If I go look at the layout, let's take a look at the layout for home right now. So layout for home, and pull this up when it initializes, when it figures out the designer. So in the designer, there's really not much of anything, right? The things that are in the designer don't really have a good preview, right? So we're not really seeing much there. So in terms of working with the home screen, I'm primarily going to look at it from the code view because the designer isn't really all that helpful, okay? So if we look at what we already have, on the outside you can see that there's a constraint layout, okay? And within that I have a view pager and I have the bottom nav. But that's all that's in here, right? And they're taking up the entire space of the screen, which is fine for phones, but is not where I want to go for tablets. So in order for this to work for the way that I'm trying to do it, I'm going to need a different layout that I can use with tablets, right? And so we've kind of gone through making alternate layouts. This is where I'm going to start, is I'm going to make an alternate layout for home that is used at the 600 dp breakpoint. So it's going to take effect, and at 600 dp, we're going to switch from this layout to a different layout. Okay? So I'm going to take the approach that we kind of landed on before. I'm going to go to the project view. I'm going to go under, here I'm being app, source, main, res. I'm going down to layout. So this is where we've got our layout here, is home. I'm going to make a copy of that, copy of home, and put it under layout 600 dp. That way I'm starting with the exact same layout on tablets or on 600 or wider as I have for phones. Right?
Can
That
you
way
show
we
that
have the
again?
same starting point.
You just copied the layout for home?
Yeah, I just copied
pasted
the
it.
layout from the layout folder to the layout 600 dp folder.
Did you have to explicitly make that folder, or did it offer you the choice?
It was already here because I already have other alternatives, right? I already have two variants, so I'd already created that previously.
Okay.
If you hadn't created layout W600dp that's next to layout, then yeah, you need to create that. So step one is to make that copy. Now, it can be helpful just to try and make the designer work a little bit better, to try and put some sort of background color on this. Yep.
Go ahead and let you finish.
Yeah. So I made this copy. I may want to go ahead and put a background color in just so we can see where things are going. So maybe under the view pager, I'll go enter tools, background, and I'm going to do this as red. So FF0000. So that's going to make the background of this. Now notice I'm doing tools background instead of Android background because I don't want this actually to be visible when the app runs. It's just helpful from visualizing it in the designer. So tools : background, and maybe I make this one a little bit of a darker red. So number CC 0000. So Charlie, Charlie, and FF for the other one. Difference there is, oh, maybe that's not as clear. Maybe I need a different. Maybe I'll just go all the way with green. So green for the bottom, 00 FF 00. There we go. So we can see where the edges of those different components are, but it won't affect the colors of when it runs. Does that make sense? The point is I want to actually want to use this constraint layout out here, and so I'd like it to work in the designer, but the problem is if it's just white, it's very hard to tell where I'm putting these things, or very hard to visualize it. In terms of previewing this on the device, you'll also want to go up here under the device in particular. I'm going to pick the 7-inch tablet, the Nexus 7. And I'm going to make sure that that is in landscape mode so I'm getting a good preview of what we're working with. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to take both of these elements and kind of push them and then be on the left of the screen instead of occupying the full width of the screen. Right? So that's step number one. So right now both of their widths are set to 0 dp. I'm going to change them both to be 300 dp. So now they're both going to be a width of 300. Okay, so you can see that they're not taking up the whole side of the screen. You can see that by the two sides that are white. But it's also being centered right now because we have anchors on both the left and the right side of the screen. Everybody see that? So I need to remove the constraints that are anchoring it to the right. Okay. Now, one question you should ask is, okay, I picked 300 dp essentially out of thin air, right? Essentially out of thin air, I just said, hey, let's go for the side panel is 300 dp wide. Is there a reason that maybe I picked those numbers? Well, think about our breakpoint, right? Our breakpoint, yep.
Like you said, the breakpoint 600. So
Breakpoint 600. So I know there's at least 600 worth of space, which means that I'm taking up at most 50% of the screen is occupied by the list. And more likely less, right? Because if the screen is any bigger than 600, then more of that weight is going to end up for the details. And I'm okay with that because I've already kind of tested and said, oh, well, one column of items is about good, you know, for every 300 dp, right? So I kind of have a good idea that's probably going to work for me, is having 300 dp be the width of the items. And that means they're kind of, the width of the items is relatively fixed, whereas, you know, the extra space is kind of going to go to the details, okay? Another thing to notice there is that's a fixed width, okay? What have we done with fixed widths before? We've extracted them, right? So I probably want to extract that number and have it be some sort of dimens value. Does that make sense? I probably want to extract that and have it be a dimens value rather than being hard-coded in there like it is. Okay? So on the 300 dp, you can start with either one. I'm going to hit Alt-Enter. I'm going to extract it. And I need to give it a name. Okay? So I might call it something like home sidebar width or it could be home list with either one. Either one is fine, right? So I need to give it a name. I'm going to add that to values. Actually, I don't want that to be, oh yeah, I want that to be under demands. I want it to be on values. I also want it to be under values 600 and 900. So I'm going to put a copy, maybe I just start with, maybe I'll just start with, I guess I end up needing it there. I'm going to just do 600 and the base, okay? So the base phone and 600. And so this also lets me adjust, if I decide I want to adjust the sidebar, I can adjust it to be different sizes based on how much screen space we have available, right? So I might adjust that and make that bigger as we have more screen space available, okay? So I'm going to extract that, values in 600, okay? That's going to switch this over here. That's going to switch this over here, okay? So I'm going to switch both of those over to being, why did that not like it? Okay, it worked there. So both of those are pointing to the same dimen value because both of those two components should have the same width. Both the bottom nav bar as well as the recycler view or the view pages should be the same width. Now, if I go back to my files, I'm going to switch back over to the Android view. If I start taking a look at my dimens, I may want to fine-tune these a little bit more. Okay, so when I added it, it strictly just went and added it down to the bottom, right? And I might want to move that back up to the top. Okay, so as the baseline, okay, one question to ask is how wide is the list by default? Well, by default, it's actually 0, right? So actually, the proper setting I probably want it to be down here in this first file of dimens is probably, it should be 0, right? Because it's taking up the full width. Over into the next one, next dimens. So under dimens 600, again, it just added it to the end. So I'm going to move it up to the top to keep it together. So in 600, I'm going to say the width of that list is 300, but now I want that to just be one column, okay? Because we've shrunk down how much space is available for that list. It's no longer full screen, okay? So I'm going to have one column and 300 dp is the width there. For the next step up, we can kind of think about that. Okay, so let's say if I make it 300 dp, how many columns should there be? Probably just one, right? So those numbers kind of go together. So one column, 300 dp, 1200. I might still keep it at 300. And say this is one column. Now, we can come back later, we can kind of tune this, and we can say, hey, maybe at some point I want to make it a little bit wider, and then we can go to more columns if there's maybe too much space available for the details. But I'm going to start with, there's always only one column of items instead of multiple columns. Does that make sense? In terms of tuning, kind of ties in with what we want, what we did with dimens. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about dimens first before we got into this. So this is kind of something you're aware of. Okay? So let's just try that as is with those changes in place.
You set the same settings essentially for all four widths, default,
Yeah.
6, 9, 12.
Except for the base, the default is 0 in one column.
0 dp.
Yeah. So here we're seeing now that it's one column, it's over on the left. If I turn it sideways, it's this, okay? Now, one weird thing to notice here, notice what layout it's using for the list. How wide is the list right now?
300.
300, okay? But what layout is it using?
Your tablet version.
It's using the tablet version. It's using the width of 600. So anytime we're dealing with these qualifiers are based on the width of the screen, not based on the available space. That's one of the gotchas when you're working with fragments like this, is those qualifiers are not based on the available space. So the fragment itself is 300 dp, but it's using a layout that's designed for 600 dp. Okay, it's not going to switch that out. Okay, so we may need to change where that breakpoint is if it doesn't make sense for us to have those two drop downs next to each other. It kind of looking like it might just work. It might just be fine here to have both of those side by side. But it might be something we need to tune. Okay? So nothing's happening there. We're still back to here. There's still one column. One thing I might quickly do too is test this on a phone. Just make sure we're aware with one thing that's happening. Just making sure. So 0 and 50 is the height. Give it a minute to fire up. So on a phone, we haven't really changed the layout, right? On portrait, it's still the same as it was. I can click in and that'll take me to the other page. But one thing to notice on this phone, on the Pixel, if I turn it sideways and let it rotate, notice that it's switching into that 600 dp version. Everybody see that? That may or may not be desirable depending on what you're trying to go for. I think in this case it's probably going to work out fine to leave it that way, but it might be something where you need to fine tune if that's not what you're trying to achieve, right? On a phone portrait is kind of a hard one to figure out because sometimes it's like a tablet, sometimes it's more like a phone. But in general, there's very limited space, so it can be hard to kind of figure out what to do in that particular layout. But that's what's going on right now. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is going back to my home layout, and again focusing on what we have here. Make sure that you're in the 600 dp version, okay, and not the base, the default version. What I want to do now is to put something over on the right that's going to fill up that available space. Okay? If I look under the designer, I go into my toolbox and say, hey, I'm going to look for fragment. What I want is a fragment container view. I'm going to drop that over here. It's going to ask me which fragment I want, and I don't actually want a fragment to be in there initially, so I may just have to do this in code because it's forcing me to have one there. So maybe in code instead I'll add it, fragment container view. This is the same view that we added yesterday to make the layout for the new movie details screen. So that layout let's say I'm going to start it at 200 dp by 200 dp just so that we can see it. I'm going to change those widths and heights in a second. Tools, background is 0000 FF, so that's going to be blue, and that way I can at least see where it is on screen. Okay, so just giving it some dimensions and some width, that way I can see where it is. Okay, so what I want to do is anchor it to all of those corners with no margins. I want it to go all the way to the edge, and then we're going to crank up these widths and heights to 0 so that it'll expand to fill that void. Now, that's what you should end up with as your layout. So we have the view pager, bottom navigation, and now a fragment container view occupying all of the right side of that screen. One more thing we have to do is quickly add an ID to it because we're going to need to refer to that by its ID. So Android ID is at plus ID slash home details container. Details container. Home details container. That's what I'm calling it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna kind of dynamically pop in whatever sort of fragment that we want. We'll put it into that container. Cool. But unlike the other one, this container is only taking up part of the screen instead of taking up the entire screen. Okay. All right, back to the code now. Now that we've got that set up, we can start populating and working with the code. So I need to go to the home activity. Okay. There's now another view that may be here, so I need a new variable to hold that. So underneath these views, I've got the pager and the bottom nav. Add private. Fragment, container view, and this is the details container. I do believe that's what I call it. Yes. Okay. So under on create, I need to find it. And there we go. Okay. So one thing to be aware of, right? So I've got two different layouts, two different variants of the layout for home. One of those variants has this container, one of those variants doesn't. Okay. So if the screen is 600 dp or wider, this is going to come back with that container. If the screen is smaller, this is going to come back null. So basically we're going to have to operate and work on some of our behavior is going to be different based on whether or not that container is null. Make sense? That's basically how we're going to determine which of the two layouts are in there. We're not going to look at how big the screen actually is. We're just going to go off of whether that container is there or not. Because it turns out that it's actually really hard to check the width of the screen, and there actually are a bunch of gotchas where that may be an issue. So for instance, one of the things that to consider is we've got these foldable phones, right? With the way that we're setting this up, it might well be that when the phone is closed, it's using the phone layout, and when you expand it, it's then using the tablet layout, which is actually something I want, right? But if I was checking based on phone screens, that might be an issue. It also can be an issue with, you can actually run, some devices will let you run multiple devices at the same time. So I might be running one app on the right side and another app on the left side. And so if I was checking the screen width, that would give me the incorrect answer. And it would make it look like, oh, I'm occupying the full width. So that's the way we're going to work around checking the size of the screen. We won't actually check the size of the screen. We'll just go based off of what's available from the map. Cool? Okay. And that actually gives us more flexibility because we can set up the resources in a bunch of different ways to determine what devices have this layout and what devices have this. And I don't have to put all that code into the Java code. Okay, so details container. Effectively what I want to do is I want to say when the user picks an item from the list, I want it to pop in to that container. Okay? Instead of opening another activity, I just want to open it as a fragment within that right side. So everybody following with me there? Okay. So right now, what happens when the user clicks on an item? Well, if I look at the code, right, that code right now is not in home activity, right? If I look into some of the other classes that are there, it's not even in the movie list activity, right? The location where we determine what happens is actually all the way down here in the movie list adapter, right? So here is my on-click listener. Which one is it? Item view. It's this one. So this is what determines what happens when the user clicks on a movie. Okay. Now, it's hard-coded right now to send off an intent to open up a new screen, right? I don't want it to do that anymore, at least not all the time, okay? Now, I have a problem here in that there's no possible way that this adapter would know about the container. It really shouldn't, right? It's well outside of its wheelhouse for it to feed up all those layers and make some assumptions about what's going on there, right? So really it needs to be home activity's decision about how to handle that. Does that make sense to everybody? Really needs to be home activity's decision to handle that and determine what happens when the user clicks and selects a movie, right? So that code can't be here, right? I can respond to the on-click listener, but I can't handle the actual action here, okay? Is there any tools that we have in our belt that will allow us to move this code from here to some other place? What comes to your mind? Or anything that I can do here to move this code elsewhere? Cody? Chase.
Base activity.
Okay, base activity? Okay, but isn't base activity, the base is used for all of the activities?
Right.
Right? That would still be a thing. I don't wanna bind this to the activity, right? This adapter, in some sense, is kind of bound to the activity, but I really don't want that to be bound to the activity directly. Michael. Brandon. Give everybody a chance to answer this. If not, I'll kind of throw what I have on the board. Brandon?
Yeah, I don't really have any food right now.
Evan?
Yes. So we don't have an instance of our activity in the adapter, right?
We don't really, and even if I did, I don't want to use it. That's the important thing, and what's one of the important things to understand. I don't want to reference directly to the activity, because that's going to create too many links or tight links that I don't want to be their dependencies. Because then you get circular dependencies, partly because, well, what is our dependency chain right now?
Starts with the activity,
I have home activity up at the top.
which creates a model and an adapter.
Actually, it doesn't right now. So I've got home activity.
Oh yeah, well that home activity won't do that.
Which has a reference to the movie list fragment.
Mhm.
And movie list fragment has a reference to two things. It has a reference to movie list view model
And the adapter.
and the adapter, that's correct. So it's referring to both of those things, movie list adapter, right? So that's the connection between the different classes that I have. Yeah. If this class were to reach up and access the activity, we now have a giant circular dependency, which might not bite you today, but will bite you eventually, okay? That is not an innocuous thing to have a circular dependency. You really want your dependencies to be one way, ideally top to bottom, right?
So then when we instantiate the adapter, can't we just pass in another variable in the constructor so it can hold on to whether or not our whatever fragment container is null or not?
Maybe.
Like for example, when
But
we
let's
pass
think
the model in the
more
context.
general than that, right? Because the problem is if you're saying, let's pass some sort of Boolean, right, to say do this or do that, that still ties this level down here to how the layout is functioning up here. Right? And for me to change the fragment that appears up here would potentially require me to, instead of doing an intent, to somehow replace the fragment. I really don't want a reference to the fragment container view all the way down here. Does that make sense? Right, so part of the issue is dependencies, okay? So one of the things that I do have, and I could do, remember what we did yesterday, I had this issue where I have the fragment we just created and the activity that I just created, and I need to somehow pick what movie's shown. Well, what I did is I kind of used the view model as the communication mechanism, as a communication vehicle, right? I said, okay, these have a common reference to the same view model, so I can change the view model and both sides will be affected, right? So one option I could take is I could say, hey, maybe home activity needs to refer to the view model, and the adapter can also refer to the view model.
The adapter already does.
Adapter already does, because I needed that for other things. So maybe the adapter triggers something in the view model, and that then triggers something in home activity. And that way they're not directly connected, right? Because I don't know what doing here, I don't know what outcome that will have, but it will have the outcome that I want, right? So one thing I could do is I could add another function to the view model to say effectively, here I selected a movie or set movie ID or put some sort of method on here on the model, which will affect and change the movie ID, which is then shared in all three places. Does that make sense? So that's one thing I could do. One thing I could do is I could do communication through the view model, because all of these different pieces have the view model, and I'm kind of okay with the communication happening that way. The fact that I would use live data along the way also helps break some of those dependencies. Because if I'm doing traditional dependencies, then those things are all synchronous and they have to kind of happen in period. And if one of them throws an exception, then the kind of whole chain breaks down. So one of the things that gives me is I can put the value into live data, and then later it can fire off the thing that needs to happen, which is to change the activity or put the new details in there. That can happen kind of asynchronously and then also independently. So it does break some of those dependencies really well, having that live data in there. Okay? There's another approach I could take, which is kind of what I showed you with the chooser dialogues, remember, is I passed in or created my own kinds of listeners, right? So one option I could take is I could say, rather than trying to communicate through the ViewModel, which I might actually end up being an option, and that might be the right one to take depending on your scenario. Another option I could say is, let's use some sort of on-selected listener of some sort, say on-selected. When you select a movie, the adapter will call that listener, and that listener could be either provided by the fragment or can be provided by the activity, right? It could go up and say, okay, this thing happened, tell me about it, right? So I have really two approaches here. I can take the approach of providing a listener, or I can take the approach of providing the view model and a method on it, okay? Now, I think that a lot of people would argue, there's the general consensus on how to do these things is that large in part, usually the preference in the Java community is to provide listeners over having, say, the adapter reference the model. I'd say if you ask most engineers and architects, they would say, hey, I would just provide a listener that's more abstract and takes more of the details maybe out of the adapter space and leaves them more to upper echelons to deal with them. Does that make sense? So I say that most would do that. We still run into a little bit of a problem in that if I want to do that, okay, it's not hard to provide a listener from the fragment down to the adapter. That's easy. But how do I provide a listener from the home activity down to the fragment? Yeah.
We just provide another listener from the fragment to the home activity.
Effectively, yeah. We need another listener here. It could be the same. It could be the same interface, but effectively this needs to call a listener, which tells the movie list, and the movie list calls another listener, right? But I have to inject this listener down into the fragment. Okay. If I'm constructing the fragment, maybe I can provide that as a constructor argument, maybe. Except then I have to deal with some lifecycle weirdness of like what happens if I want to turn it sideways and preserve that listener, right? That bind or that connection doesn't necessarily survive a screen rotation, even though the fragment, as we kind of saw, does survive it. But the fragment's going to get recreated when I turn it sideways, so then that new fragment won't have the listener anymore. Okay. There's also just the issue. There's also the other approach if I can create fragments is using a bundle. But I can't put a listener into a bundle because a listener can't be serialized. It's inherently a reference to an object, so there's no real way to serialize a listener, so I can't hand it to a bundle. Is everybody following me there? So a lot of times I might want to choose to do a listener. I might want to choose to move that up. But the problem is that this connection kind of makes that infeasible. So let's do it through the ViewModel. Because it turns out the ViewModel is really easy. right? We've kind of already talked about how to use the view models and how to use live data. Okay. So let's look at this. So if I go to the view model, I'm going to jump up to the movie list view model. So part of the understanding is here, what we're looking at kind of seems like a simple situation, but it turns out there's a lot of architecture decisions that go into something like this. And so you have to kind of consider those choices as you make them. So under the movie list view model, what I might want to add is maybe some way to communicate what the selected movie is. Does that make sense? I might want to be able to communicate what the selected movie is. So under live data, I might put that in here somewhere. Maybe I'll just drop it at the end. Private, final, mutable live data. Okay, and this would be something like the selected movie. Okay, now I've intentionally kind of left the type out here because I'm going to ask you, what should it be? Right? What is the type of the selected movie? Okay. Well, I've got two basic options, right? It could either be a movie summary, or it could just be the ID of the movie. Both are viable, right? Which one would you choose? Given the choice between the movie object or just the ID of the movie, which makes more sense?
Is that a fair question? Neither of them makes any more sense than the other.
Okay.
All you want to use the data for is to query the database for the details of one movie.
Mm-hmm.
So you only need to know its ID in order to do that.
Right. So I don't really need the ID in order to load either the appropriate activity. The only thing that goes through there is the intent, or the ID in order to pick the right thing in the view model. So really all I have to have is the ID. Okay. But if the user is selecting it from the list, actually I do have the movie summary. Mm-hmm. Right? I actually have the whole thing. The trade-off is if I choose to do the ID, it'll satisfy all of our needs right now. But maybe it won't satisfy our needs in the future. I don't know that. I can't see that far out. And so I might maybe someday need to change that. But if I put in the summary, that should cover all my future needs. It's very unlikely that that would not cover any future need that I might have because it includes the ID plus all of the other extra information. And so it means that I don't need to do potentially, hey, let me go look through the list and search through the list to find the particular thing with that ID, or make another database query if I need the name of the movie or other pieces of information. It can be extra complicated because remember, sometimes this list of movies comes from the library, or sometimes it comes from your list, and sometimes it comes from, the movies table, the library table, or the wish list table. So it's not easy to just necessarily query it again and find that original data. So for future sanity, I'm going to put this in as movie summary. Just in case something down the line might want to make us do that. So that's one of the things to consider as you're making some of these architecture decisions, is try to think forward, and is that change going to limit you later? If that change might limit you later, then maybe you don't want to make that decision. Even if one decision or another might work for you today, right? You also have to have a little bit of future sight of where things are going. Okay. So I'm going to add that in, and I'm going to add that in here. Selected movie is new mutable live data. We're going to start it out as null because there's no movie selected initially. I need a getter for that so we can observe it. So I'm going to go down and add that getter. So under this one, public live data movie summary get selected movie, and that's going to return selected movie. Okay, so I've got a getter. I'm also going to need a setter for the very reason that this is going to then be set by the adapter effectively. So under here, I'm going to say public void set selected movie, and that's going to return, or it's not return, I need to take the movie summary. Movie summary and in here I would say selected movie, or this dot selected movie dot post value, and set that to the movie that you're selecting. So you select a movie, we can then post a value, and wherever else in the code we can handle that. Does that make sense to everybody? That way, the communication, right, we could potentially set the selected movie from a few different places. It wouldn't necessarily need to be the adapter. Maybe we could have other ways that we set it. Maybe it's set by keyboard interactions. Maybe the user can press up and down on the keyboard and that changes the selected movie. And that could then coordinate everything. And then, you know, in our home activity, we can then kind of show or do the appropriate action based on what layout we're currently in. Okay? So I would start with that and say set selected movie. There's a getter and a setter now. And I can work back to the adapter, the movie list adapter. And rather than the code that I have here, which I'm going to comment out, I'm going to put in model dot set selected movie, and I'm going to just set that to the movie you just clicked on. Right? So you click on a movie, and the adapter doesn't really do anything other than tell the model about the change. Okay? That way, whoever's observing the model can choose how to handle it. Questions? Does that make sense to everybody? Kind of extracting that, moving that out. All right. So, all right, with that in mind, I've made the change to the adapter. If we were to test it right now, if I tap on a movie, nothing's actually going to happen because there is no code observing that right now. So what I want to do is go back to home activity, and I want to be able to have access to that model. Okay, so I don't have a reference to the ViewModel right now. I need to fix that. So private movie list ViewModel, and I might want to be more restrictive with this movie list model. Because I'm going to have the user list model in there as well. And I think I can add that as well while I'm thinking about it. Private user list ViewModel. So I've got a reference to both of those models. And so I need to get those objects and put that down here at the end. Get models. And so what I'm going to say is the movie list model is equal to new ViewModel provider. Pass in this. and get movie list ViewModel.class, and also for the user list model would be the same story, equals new ViewModel provider, this get movie or user list, because I'm going to end up needing to do this for both. Right? For both of those, you have the potential of selecting something. Okay. So let's say I have that. I now can bind or observe the models. And so I might want to say like movie list model dot get selected movie dot observe. Oh no, not set. I want get. That's why. Get selected movie dot observe. We're gonna keep it going as long as the home activity is active. And I just need to provide a lambda function. So effectively what we want to say is when the user selects a movie, we need to then determine either we're going to use an intent or we're going to use a change to what fragment is visible. Okay. So in the case of if there is a fragment, if there's no fragment container, so we need to check the details container. If it's null, then we still want to do what we had done before, right? Which is to have that intent go out. And so context is now this. Import that. Okay. So intent, create a new intent for movie details, put an extra for movie details ID, take the movie ID, and this dot start activity. Okay. So in the case where we have the details container, that's what I want it to do. Or, sorry, I don't have the details container. I'm running on the phone. Okay. So let's confirm that that code is working as we expect it to. Okay. So I'm going to start the app and I'm going to run it on the Pixel 30. And you saw as soon as I tried to start it, as soon as I tried to go to the list, it crashed. Okay. If I look at logcat, one of the things that I have to watch out for, let's see if I can get to error. I need to be on the right device. And so I'm going to run it again. Continue as guest. And here's my error. So under home activity line 80, we got a null pointer exception because it can't try to access the ID property. Meaning that movie's null. So one of the things I didn't do in here is I forgot to check, well, remember, initially the selected movie is null. So I do have to check for that. I do have to say, well, we only want to fire an intent if there's a movie that you selected. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So I need another if statement in here. I do need to do this as nested. We'll look at this in a minute, why I need to do this as nested. But if it is actually not null, then we're going to do the intent. Otherwise, we really don't need to do anything. If there's no movie container and they don't provide a selected movie, then there's really nothing to do. Cool? In the other side of things, and actually let me test that real quick before I go to the other side of things. So if I look at that, continue as guest, all right? So I pick a movie. Well, that's interesting. Nothing's happening. Why is that? What's missing? We did run into a similar issue yesterday. Remember, we were having the fragment and the activity kind of talk to each other? And remember how we had two different view models. It's the same problem here. The fragment is referring to a different view model than the activity because we set them up differently. So I said here this is creating both of those view models based on the activity, but in the fragment they'll be created for the fragment. So in the let's see, movie list fragment, what's missing is when I create the model, I need to create that model from the activity instead of creating it from this. So that they're referring to the same view model. Okay. You're going to have the same problem when you're looking at the list of users, is they need to refer to the same model. Okay? So now they're communicating. So where we left off, we were just talking about how to get that communication, right? And so once I've got them looking at the same view model, it does work to get them over there. One weird thing to notice, though, when we step back, and let me do a rotate here. Actually, that didn't do what I thought it would do. That's interesting. I'm surprised by that. So one of the things to realize, and they already did it this time, one of the things that's kind of odd is that it's still keeping track of what the selected movie is, even after you've left that, right? So it's potentially possible that it could fire that same intent again, and that's where it like sometimes happens on screen rotation because you're hooking up new observers. I was just surprised that it didn't happen the first time. But the issue is effectively we need to be able to set the selected movie back to null somewhere in that process, right? Because we don't want it to go to the movie again. Does that make sense? So we can do that on kind of two ends. We can do that, try to do that immediately when the movie's selected to set it back to null, or we could try to do that when you return, right? We could say, hey, when you return from the other screen, then we will set it back to null. Problem with doing it returning is that's quite a bit more complicated, and it's also prone to error because it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you won't pop up two copies of that movie details selected. So the approach that I would take is actually the same thing that I've done with the snack bar, and just say, okay, maybe after we've decided that this is the case, I also need to set it back to null. So if we're going to go in here, I might want to say movie list model dot set selected movie set it back to null before I go send that intent to make sure that we don't do it twice. The placement of this is kind of important. If I put this outside of the check for the movie's null, this would result in a circular loop because it would keep posting null, keep posting null, keep posting null. So it's important that I'm only doing this when it's not null. Cool? Does that make sense in terms of clearing that out, fixing that? That's not an issue we have if we have the side-by-side, but it is an issue if you're looking at the phone version.
What file are you using?
I'm right now in home activity.
Oh, this.
So you said this change right here only affects the single fragment view,
Right.
not
This is the
side-by-side.
single fragment view. It's a little bit different if I'm talking about the side-by-side.
Okay.
Right. So let's talk about the side-by-side now. So from the phone perspective, I still need to check if the movie is null or not. Okay. In the case where we have a movie that the user selected, rather than firing off an intent, I want to show that in the fragment container. So it looked more like something what we did yesterday. And remember, I started with get support fragment manager. I started a transaction using begin transaction. I then need to replace whatever the fragment is there with the new fragment. And so this would go into r.id home details container.
Replace or remove?
Oh, I said I wanted to say replace.
Okay.
I mistyped. So replace, and I want to replace it with the movie details fragment.class, and I need to pass null as the arguments. Now this is something a little bit different than what I did yesterday. I had constructed an object and then passed it in. The other way you can do here is you can just tell it the class and give it the bundle of starting arguments. All right, so begin transaction, replace, and then commit it. So that's going to tell it to replace whatever fragment's there with a brand new fragment. Otherwise, if it's null, I need to do something similar. But in this case, I would prefer to effectively like replace what's there or remove what's there rather than having anyone be in there. And so is there a method in here that I can use to just say remove all of them? There's an is empty.
Can you replace it with null?
Maybe?
Like target the container and then pass null to it?
Maybe. I can try that. Let's see if it works. So r.id fragment home details container, and let me try null. It's kind of a hint that it might not work here.
Annotate is not.
And so you can see it's crashing if I tried to do that, because yeah, it doesn't allow null as an argument there. So what I'm probably going to have to do is have some sort of reference to it. But for the moment, let me just say I'm going to comment that out. And we'll come back to the null case. Case where there's no movie selected. So in this case, continuous guest, I'm going to pick a movie, and I have something appearing on the right, but not the right thing. Okay, so we can see that something does pop over there. We do get an event anytime that happens. It is replacing it with a new fragment, but I have kind of a built-in problem in that it's not showing the right movie. Does everybody see that? Okay. The problem is that nowhere in here have I told it which movie to show, right? Nowhere in here have I told it which movie is active, okay? And so from the movie details activity, remember we did this yesterday, remember the thing I had to do is I had to call model fetch movie, I had to tell it to fetch and load the appropriate movie, and I haven't done that step. So it also notice that that's on a different view model, right? This is on the movie details view model, right? So I actually need a reference to that view model in here as well. So I'm actually going to end up with 4 different view models when we're done with this. Private, movie, details, view model. Because we effectively need to communicate between these different view models. And I'm going to have the same thing for user. So user profile model. And I don't think I have that. Yeah, I don't have that one. So I'm going to not put that in right now. So I need a reference to the movie details view model. There's new, and I can kind of copy this and just change this to movie details. So effectively, when the user picks a particular movie, I need to go in here and say, okay, model.fetch movie, and this would be movie.id, and over in this side it would be fetch movie null, right? Because there's nothing selected. Actually, I want to do this on the tablet. So now I pick a movie here, and I've got it popping up on the right. Right. So this is kind of what I'm going for, right? Is the user picks something from the list on the left, and it appears on the right. Okay. But the only class that really knows this communication is happening is home activity, right? Home activity is really the only one that knows that there's any sort of connection between these two. In terms of the master detail flow yesterday, there was one piece that we kind of left open-ended that I wanted to have a chance to address. So if you can pull up your project, go to home activity, and I want to take a quick look at some of the code in home activity. Okay, so just to kind of show you what behavior that I'm talking about, what we kind of left open-ended yesterday is we talked about the fact, hey, let's set the or show the movie details fragment here. but we kind of left this case empty. Like, what happens if there's no movie to show, right? And I want to kind of delve into that maybe a little bit here, and just kind of talk about some other related issues. So one of the things that's happening right now with the way that we wrote that code is every time I pick a movie, whether I picked it or not before, that movie is going to cause a new fragment to be created for the right, okay? Which isn't really necessary. It's kind of wasteful because it's the same fragment every time. Like, I keep changing from one movie details fragment to another movie details fragment. So I prefer not to recreate that fragment. I prefer to recycle it. Does that make sense? Just in terms of a memory use case and in terms of a performance case. Because we're not recycling the view model, but we are recycling the fragment, and we probably should do the same for both of those. The other issue that occurs is if I go over to the user list, I could potentially still be looking at a movie, and vice versa. If I'm over on the user list, back on the movie list, I could still be looking at a user, right? So it doesn't switch when I switch lists, which it probably should, right? It probably should switch which fragments it's showing based on whether or not you're looking at the user list or the movie list. So what I would suggest is maybe we're switching the intent and switching the fragment in the wrong place, right? Maybe we don't want to switch the fragment when the user switches between a different entity or a different document. Maybe we should just switch it when they change lists. Does that make sense? And because if they're on the movies list, we don't need to change it as long as they stay on the movies list. Same if they're on the users list, we really don't need to change it as long as they're on that list. Does that follow? Make sense? So what that means is I probably don't want to really change the fragment here, where we've done that before. I really want to change that in response to what we've got up here, right? Either when the pager changes or when the bottom nav changes. But we probably want to do that in response to when that list changes, right? So I can put it into this listener or into this list. We've already got a set of if statements and if else statements here in that second one for the bottom nav, and more than likely that bottom nav is going to stick around where we might decide maybe to get rid of the pager. I would want to put into here. So under there, into those cases, we're going to say, well, okay, if you pick the movie list, let's go ahead at that time show the movie details fragment, and here we're going to show the user profile fragment. So if we do that, at least in theory, that should be the only place where we really need to change which fragment's shown. Does that make sense? Is when you change bottom nav instead. And that, I think, creates a much more logical flow of which fragment is visible. Is everyone on board there? So rather than changing it every time you click on a new movie, let's change it at the beginning, right? Or change it when you switch lists. Okay? So I'm going to move those two things in. And then in the other case down here, these listeners will take that code out. So both for selecting a user, selecting a movie, those will be just that simple. All they're doing is updating the model because that's all they need to do. And so we're just using the selection on the bottom nav to determine which fragments shown. Has everybody got that? Okay, so let's give this a try and let's see how this behaves differently. Okay. So one thing, when I get in here, I'm going to click on a movie. You might notice that once I've done this, I've actually broken it, right? I'm actually not seeing the movie I select anymore. And if I go over to users, you can see something's happening, right? So this user profile keyword got popped up. If I come back, oh, it seems to work, right? So it didn't work initially, but it worked when I left and went to users and then came back, right? And now it's selecting, I can switch between movies, and it's working as I would expect, right? So what's the part that's missing, right? Why is it having that behavior where it's not working initially?
Can you demonstrate that again?
Okay. So now, right, you can see what's happening right now. If I go back to the beginning, when I click on a movie, nothing seems to happen.
Is it because neither item is selected yet? And the event listener works based on doing the action?
The event listener works on doing the action, but it's not true that nothing's selected. So movie is selected, yes.
Because like the fragment isn't created until you click on the bottom nav?
Yeah. So until I click on bottom nav, I haven't put the fragment in there because initially I didn't put a fragment in there. Okay. And so that really means that I should have probably done that. I didn't do that, but that's partly as a demonstration. So if I go, one way that I can fix this is I could try to load that fragment in with code. I believe there's also a way that we can do this in terms of loading it in with the XML. So if I go into the, let's see what screen we're on. We're on home. So home, go to the 600 dp version. Under here, right, we have this fragment container. If I did the drag and drop, you did see that it kind of asked you actually which fragment you want to have in there initially. I did this with code, so I didn't have to select that. But the property in here that we're concerned with is called name, Android name. When I type in Android name, it'll ask me which fragment do I want to put here. So I'm going to tell it to use the movie details fragment. And so by adding that, I've kind of told it, here is the fragment that should be here at the beginning, right? Rather than being nothing there, I can put a different fragment there. And in fact, part of the question that we were asking yesterday of, well, how do I replace it with null? Well, typically that means you have some sort of placeholder or empty fragment that just basically has no content. So if you need to swap in, if you do need to swap in something, you might want to create a placeholder fragment of some sort. And that might be what you have here as well. Okay? So by putting that in, we should, I do believe that will fix the bug. So if I click the movie, there we go. So now initially it's working, right? I don't have to switch over to users and back. But this kind of flow does mean that I can kind of have a user picked on a movie picked on the movie list and a user picked on the user list and switch between those two, which is actually kind of nice, right? I can pick one thing on both lists and have it remember my selection. All right. Questions? Does that kind of make sense? Answer some of the weird behavior maybe you might have seen yesterday. Another thing I might mention in this regard, there's another minor oddity in that initially you'll notice on the right that it's completely blank, right? If we had looked at the code kind of how it was, I would have expected it to at least tell me that there's no movie selected, right? And so if I look at specifically the ViewModel, the movie details view model, one of the things that I see, okay, here initially we run the constructor. Okay, every time we create a view model, we do run the constructor, but we've got this other method called fetch movie that doesn't get run until you select a movie. Does that make sense? And only at that point do I change the error message to be no movie selected, right? Only at that point do I change the error message, right? So basically the problem is that initially that error message isn't there. Does that make sense? Initially it's blank. So if I make a minor tweak up top and I say, hey, let's initialize that error message to r.string dot, what did I call it? Error no movie selected. I think that's the one. So if I use that same string to initialize it in the constructor, then that problem's solved. So you do have to kind of pay attention to what you're doing in the constructor, because I think previously we've made the assumption that fetch movie is always called, or fetch user is always called, but notice that in this case it's not called initially, which is fine, right? It's fine that it's not called initially, but that does mean we need to make sure that we are a little bit more careful about how we initialize things. Cool? So that's really all you have to do to fix that one issue, is just say, hey, I'm going to initialize the error with this. And that way initially it comes up and says, hey, there's no movie selected, please select one. I could also, if I wanted to make that more user-friendly, you could have started with, say, a placeholder fragment and put maybe a placeholder in there initially until the user picked something. Cool? Okay. I think that's really, those are really the things I wanted to kind of call to your attention. Also, you know, one thing to pay attention to is how your, I saw this on a few people, how your snack bars are showing up, because there's a few snack bars that were initially kind of showing up right away when you started the app and those kind of things. So you might want to dig into a little bit with that. You might notice on mine that it's not having some of those snack bars. You can take a look at the fetch movie code. I've made some few tweaks there, and you can kind of see how I'm adjusting for that. Okay. So, all right. Then I'll just let you guys get back to lab and work through what you have.